The desert sun was sinking when Luke Carver found them two Apache girls huddled beneath a dead mesquite tree, skin blistered, lips cracked from thirst. They didn't speak his language, but the fear in their eyes said enough. He gave them water, bread, and a place by his fire. "You're safe now," he said, though he wasn't sure it was true. 3 days later, as the wind carried a storm across the canyon, a figure appeared on the ridge, a woman wrapped in black hides, face painted in ash. She rode alone, silent as a shadow. The youngest girl whispered one word that made Luke's blood run cold: "Mother." That night, the woman came not to thank him, but to collect a debt the frontier had long buried. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The woman's eyes, dark as the desert night, flickered toward the ridge where the storm clouds churned like a restless sea, her expression unreadable but carved from something older than grief. Luke stood, the weight of her words sinking into his chest like a stone in still water. The fire cracked between them, throwing fleeting light across her face painted in ash, streaked by travel, beautiful in a way that carried danger. The two girls clung to her hides, whispering fast, their Apache syllables rising and falling like a song meant to ward off spirits. Luke caught fragments, names, maybe, or warnings, but their mother's voice cut through, low and certain. "They followed you," she said, not as a question but as a sentence. "Men who take what they think belongs to them." Luke's pulse quickened. He'd seen riders 2 nights back, silhouettes against the dunes. Thought they'd been traders or drifters heading west. "Who are they?" he asked. The woman looked at him, as if pitying a child who had never known fear. "They wear blue coats now," she said. "Once, they wore red dust." Her gaze drifted back to the horizon, and Luke understood before the thunder came soldiers, or worse, the kind of men who'd seen Apache blood as coin and slaughter as sport. The wind rose, and sand whipped through the camp, scattering the embers. The girls pressed close to their mother. Luke stepped forward, instincts sharpened from years on the frontier. "We can ride before they get here," he said, nodding toward his horse, tethered by the rock. "There's a dry creek bed east, maybe 5 miles. But the woman shook her head slowly. "No running," she murmured. "No hiding. They come for you, not me." He opened his mouth to argue, but something in her tone froze him. "For me?" he said. "I've got no quarrel with anyone." Her expression didn't change. "You gave them reason when you gave kindness to my blood." A flash of lightning cracked across the sky, splitting the world for a breathless instant. Then came the rumble deep, rolling, alive. Luke turned toward the ridge, where faint movement stirred figures on horseback, black shapes against the dying Sunday. The woman reached into her satchel, pulling out a long knife carved from bone, the edge gleaming pale. She pressed it into Luke's hand. "You saved my daughters," she said again. "Now you must stand with them." The blade was warm, though it had no right to be. The girls clutched each other, watching the dark riders approach, their small faces lit by the last trembling glow of the fire. "Who are you?" Luke whispered, the question falling out before he could stop it. The woman looked at him then fully, deeply, her eyes carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. "I am what they made me," she said, voice almost lost to the wind. "And tonight, they will remember." The air thickened with electricity, the scent of rain and blood, waiting just beyond the storm's edge. As the first drop hit the dust, Luke realized what she meant by saving him. Whatever was coming wasn't a fight, it was a reckoning. And by taking those girls in, he'd already chosen his side. The night stretched long and uneasy, the kind that breathed cold into the bones and made every sound feel like a whisper from the dead. Luke stirred awake to the faint scrape of metal against leather and saw Nita outlined in the dim firelight, her form motionless except for the slow rise of her breath. The rifle rested in her hands, barrel angled toward the black horizon, where the hills rolled like sleeping beasts under the silver wash of the moon. The girls lay tangled together under his worn blanket, their faces softened by exhaustion, but even in sleep, their small fingers clutched each other as if letting go meant being lost forever. Luke rose quietly, boots crunching over dry earth. "Can't sleep?" he asked in a low voice, though he already knew the answer. Nita didn't turn. Sleep is for those who are not hunted, she said. Her tone was calm, but there was a tension in it, stretched tight as a bowstring. Luke joined her at the edge of camp, scanning the open dark where sage and sand met sky. You think those riders will come tonight? He asked. They come for what they lost, she said again, softer this time, and when Luke looked at her, her eyes were distant, as if she were listening to something far away. He started to ask what she meant, but she spoke first. The men who burned our village, they thought we were nothing, took our land, our dead, even our names. My daughters ran. I did not. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice did not. I stayed and buried them. The words hit Luke like a gust of wind through the chest, cold and sharp. You mean the raiders? He said, though he already felt the answer in the still air. Nita nodded once. White men in soldier coats, led by one who called himself Captain Reeves. He killed my husband, took the river that fed our home, said God told him to cleanse the land. Her jaw clenched. I told him God would find him first. The fire popped behind them, sending a spark spiraling upward like a lost soul. And Luke thought of the storm she had stared into the night before, how the thunder had sounded like hooves. You think those men followed you here? He asked, his voice rough. No, she said, eyes glinting. Not the men. She pointed toward the black line of hills, the ones they left behind. The words hung between them like a curse. For a moment, Luke thought she meant survivors. But then a cold draft slid through camp, stirring the ashes, and the horses snorted, restless, eyes rolling white. The girls whimpered in their sleep, murmuring words Luke didn't know. Spirits, Nita whispered. The dead remember. They follow me because I carry their names. I speak to them in dreams, and they answer, in thunder. Luke swallowed hard, the wind pressing against him like an unseen hand. He'd heard frontier tales of ghost trails and vengeful warriors, but something in her voice stripped those stories of superstition and left only truth. If they follow you, he said, then what happens to us when they arrive? Nita finally looked at him, and for the first time, he saw fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for what might come. Then, she said quietly, we pray they come for the guilty. A sudden howl tore through the canyon, echoing like a scream carried by the wind, and the horses reared, eyes wild. Nita raised her rifle, the barrel gleaming under the moonlight. It begins, she whispered, and Luke knew then that dawn might never come the same again. The dawn came slow and bruised, light spilling over the canyon like a wound reopening, and Luke felt the unease that had haunted the night settle deep into his skin. The wind carried the scent of rain and iron, and somewhere far off, a coyote's cry tangled with the hush of the waking desert. He rose to fetch water from the stream that cut near the camp, but as he passed the ridge of sandstone above their fire, he froze. There etched into the rock were spirals and clawed lines, drawn in ash darkened by what looked too much like blood. The markings twisted inward, overlapping like a whirlpool dragging itself into the earth. His stomach turned, but he reached out anyway, brushing his calloused fingers over the grooves. The stone was cold, slick, and when he pulled his hand back, a smear of red streaked across his palm. Nita appeared behind him, silent as smoke, her eyes hollow from a night without sleep. You shouldn't touch, she said, voice low. What the hell is this? Luke muttered, wiping his hand on his jeans. Looks like something a scared child would carve. But she shook her head. No child makes that mark. It belongs to the old ones, to those who remember. The first blood spilled on this land. Her gaze lingered on the spirals, and her jaw tightened. It's a warning, and a curse, for those who give shelter to my blood. Luke barked a short laugh, trying to cut through the tension creeping along his spine. A curse? I've seen curses before usually end with whiskey and regret. But she didn't smile. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a talisman, strung with turquoise beads and shards of carved bone, holding it to her lips as she murmured something in Apache. The air seemed to still around her, and even the wind felt quiet, as if listening. Luke turned away, shaking his head, trying to bury the chill running up his neck. Superstition, he told himself. Just superstition. But as the sun climbed higher, unease turned to something darker. His horse, usually calm as stone, began to snort and stomp, nostrils flaring as if it smelled a predator. When Luke tried to calm it, the animal reared, muscles taut with terror, nearly crushing the younger girl as she darted past. Luke lunged, grabbing the reins and forcing the horse down, his heart hammering as dust filled the air. The girl stumbled back, eyes wide, tears streaking her dirt-stained cheeks. "It's all right," he said, but his voice trembled. Behind him, Nita watched with a grim stillness, clutching her talisman tight. "It begins," she whispered again, the same words she'd spoken in the night. Luke turned on her, frustration masking fear. "You think your ghost spooked my horse?" he snapped. But she only looked at him, pity softening her gaze. "The land remembers," she said quietly, "and it does not forget what was stolen." She pointed toward the horizon, where the hills glowed like coals under the morning Sunday. "The spirits test you now. If your heart is false, they will take from you as men took from us." The girls huddled close, silent and trembling. Luke wanted to laugh again, to chase away the dread pressing down on him, but he couldn't find the sound. The wind rose suddenly, hot and sharp, carrying a whisper that sounded almost like his name. He stared at the rocks, at those spirals cut deep into stone, and for the first time since this began, Luke Carver felt the desert watching him back. The night fell heavy and strange, the kind of darkness that seemed to press against the skin and breathe down the back of the neck. The wind had shifted, rising from the canyon floor like something alive, carrying with it the low hum of voices that didn't belong to any living soul. At first, Luke thought it was just the echo of wind through the stone. He'd heard it before. 1,000 nights on the frontier, but this was different. The sound was too deliberate, a slow, rhythmic murmur like the beating of a heart. He rose from his bedroll, the fire's glow flickering across his face, and caught Nita's silhouette standing near the flames, her head bowed, lips moving in a whisper. "You hear that?" he asked, pulling his coat tight against the cold. She didn't answer, only lifted her eyes toward the canyon's edge, where shadows moved in the half-light. The chanting rose, soft but steady, carrying syllables older than the land itself. Luke grabbed his rifle and circled the camp, scanning every ridge, every line of rock and brush. Nothing, just empty desert, silver under the moon. Yet the air buzzed, charged with something unseen. He knelt, pressing a hand to the ground, and felt a faint vibration running beneath his palm, like a distant drumbeat buried deep in the earth. When he turned back, the girls were awake, clutching each other, wide-eyed. The youngest, her voice barely a whisper, said, "They're here." Luke followed her gaze toward the fire, and his breath caught. The flames, once steady, were twisting now, bending unnaturally, forming shapes that wavered like smoke-made people. He saw outlines, tall figures wrapped in shadow, faces hidden but eyes burning faintly, pale as stars. They moved in a slow circle around the fire, their gestures graceful, mournful, like dancers bound to a song of sorrow. The chanting deepened, weaving through the crackle of the flames, filling the air with a language Luke didn't understand but somehow felt in his chest, a pulse syncing with his own heartbeat. He stumbled back, rifle raised, though it felt useless against what he was seeing. "What in God's name?" he muttered. But Nita was already kneeling, bowing her head low. "Do not speak," she said sharply. They listen. Her daughters mirrored her, their small voices joining the chant for a fleeting instant before falling silent. Luke stood frozen, the fire reflecting in his wide eyes as one of the shapes seemed to turn toward him. The air grew colder, the scent of ash and wet stone surrounding him. He felt eyes on him, hundreds, maybe thousands watching, weighing. His throat went dry, the world narrowing to the flicker of the fire and the whisper of the dead. One of the flames stretched outward, thin as a finger, curling toward his chest like it meant to touch him. He staggered back, nearly tripping over the bedrolls, and the instant his boot struck the ground, the shapes shuddered and vanished. The wind died. Silence fell, thick and absolute. Nita lifted her face, sweat glistening on her brow. "They come to remember," she said quietly, her voice trembling not with fear but reverence. "The canyon holds their bones, and their anger rides the wind." Luke said nothing, unable to tear his eyes from the fire, where for just a moment longer, he thought he saw a face staring back at him, one he almost recognized. Then the flames fell still, leaving only smoke and the faint, bitter scent of burned blood hanging in the air. The fire burned low, throwing long, trembling shadows across the canyon wall, and the silence that followed the night's hauntings was heavier than any sound. Luke sat apart from the others, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the dying coals as if they might explain what had happened. His mind replayed the ghostly dance in the firelight, the chanting that had crawled beneath his skin, and the feeling of something ancient brushing against his soul. When Nita spoke, her voice came soft, almost breaking the stillness. "You still don't understand why they come," she said. Luke turned toward her, his face hollowed by exhaustion. "You said they're your ancestors," he muttered. "That they're angry." She nodded, her gaze far away. "Yes, angry, and waiting." She reached into her satchel and drew out a small pouch tied with leather cord, the same one he'd seen her clutch when she whispered to the wind. She loosened it, and a handful of gold flakes spilled into her palm, dull, weathered, flecked with grit. Luke blinked, confused. "You've been carrying gold this whole time?" he asked. Nita stared at the flakes like they were poison. "Not mine," she said. "Theirs." She looked to the canyon, where the first traces of dawn painted the rocks in pale fire. "Years ago, the settlers came to our valley. They came with promises, treaties, gifts, words of peace. My husband, Haska, believed them. He led his band to meet them in good faith." Her voice hardened, low and flat. "They met him with rifles." Luke's chest tightened. "You mean a massacre?" he said quietly. Nita nodded once. "They killed the men, took the women, burned the rest. They said there was gold in the cliffs where we buried our dead, and they would not stop until they had it. But when they dug, the earth took them. The spirits swallowed their greed and left their bones as warning." She tossed the gold into the fire, and it hissed like rain on steel. "I found what was left years later, when I returned to bury my husband's heart. The gold still shone among the ashes, so I took it so the spirits would remember my vow." Luke frowned. "A vow?" She met his eyes then, the fire's glow turning her face into something carved by flame and sorrow. "I swore to the old ones that if my daughters lived, I would repay the blood they lost. Every man who took part would meet his end by my hand, or by the deserts. But the last of them," her voice faltered, "the last wears a blue coat. He hunts the hills even now." Luke felt a cold dread slide through him, understanding dawning like a blade drawn slow. "Reeves," he said. She nodded. "He took your land too, did he not? You know his kind." Luke clenched his jaw, memories stirring raids, burned homesteads, the sound of men laughing as everything he'd built turned to ash. "I know him," he said, voice low. Nita leaned forward, the talisman of bone and turquoise glinting against her throat. "Then you understand," she whispered. "You saved my daughters, Luke Carver. The spirits saw. Now you are bound to our oath." The words struck deep, heavier than any curse. The fire flared, sudden and bright, casting light across his face, and for an instant, Luke thought he saw figures in the flames again, watching, waiting, nodding in silent approval. "Bound," he repeated under his breath, the word tasting like iron. The wind outside the canyon began to rise again, and somewhere within its howl, he thought he heard drums. They left before dawn when the sky was a bruised slate and the wind smelled of iron, Luke's horse moving beside Nita's with slow reluctance. The two girls tucked between them beneath a thin blanket that shivered with every gust. The ride toward the hollow of bones felt like crossing into a different breathing of the world. The trail narrowed as cliffs leaned close, and the land lay pale and stripped, memory sanded down to shapes of ruin. When they crested the last rise, the canyon opened like a wound. Ledges like ribs, gullies running dry, and the floor littered with sun-bleached bone, splintered spear shafts, leather, cords rotted into thread, and the faded fragments of what people once carried. Luke's throat tightened. He had seen killing before raids and rustlers, but this accumulation of old violence made a different sorrow, raw and patient, as if the earth itself kept tally. Nita rode slower, eyes soft and hard at once, tracing the ground as if she read it like a book. The girls stared wide-eyed, their hands clenched around each other. Luke asked, voice low, Why bring them? She pointed to a shallow pit where the sun glinted off black obsidian chips. So they will remember, Nita said. So they will learn what must not be forgotten. The words landed like a stone. He thought vengeance was an act done in a pocket of night, but this was also an education, an inheritance of grief handed down in small rituals. They dismounted and walked, each step raising dust that smelled faintly of old blood. Even the horses moved with care, sensing the ground's history. Near the center of the hollow, an overturned cart lay half swallowed by sand. A splintered wheel like a pale Sunday. Nita knelt and brushed dirt away, revealing a rusted cufflink stamped with a faded initial. The girls' faces folded in something like recognition and new sorrow. My brother wore this, she said, voice flat. They traded a promise for a throat slit. Luke's hands clenched. He thought of men who burned his barn and laughed as houses fell. Anger rose, heat and uselessness that the canyon seemed to absorb. Nita stood, steady as a stake. She reached into her satchel, producing a small bundle of hair tied with sinew keeps of the dead, and offered it to him. If you are bound to our oath, she told him, then carry a name. He took the bundle like a fragile contract and felt its absurd weight, a physical claim settling in his palm. Around them the wind rose, carrying a sound that might have been an old creak or a chorus of voices, and the bones at their feet seemed to sigh. This was no single score to settle with a pistol. It was the folding of one life into many wrongs, the opening of accounts that could not be balanced by money. The girls watched him with a gaze that was child and witness both, and when he mounted again, his hands were steadier. They rode deeper into the hollow, cliffs closing behind them like a door, and Luke understood with a cold, certain clarity that he had not simply chosen to help a woman and her children. He had stepped into a ledger of vengeance whose pages would demand blood and memory in equal measure. The sun was already falling when they found the camp, a sprawl of canvas and crates wedged between the rocks like a nest of thieves. The smoke of their fire twisting up into the orange sky. The smell of roasted meat and cheap whiskey hung heavy in the air, a mockery of comfort. Luke counted 5 men, maybe 6, their faces weathered but softened by years of living off plunder, bellies round, laughter loose. The sound cut through the canyon like broken glass. Nita crouched beside him, her breath slow and even, but her eyes blazed like coals. No mercy, she whispered, each word shaped by something older than rage. Luke's stomach turned. He'd seen death too many times, men screaming in the mud, the silence after the gunfire when nothing human remained. We could wait till morning, he said quietly. Take them when they're sleeping. Make it clean. But Nita shook her head. There is no clean, she murmured. Only balance. She rose from the rocks, her rifle slung low, and for a heartbeat Luke thought she meant to walk straight into their firelight. He reached to stop her, but then one of the raiders, a thick-shouldered man with a scar down his cheek, looked up and froze. His bottle slipped from his hand, shattering in the dirt. Christ, he muttered. It's her. The next moment tore open the world. The man raised his rifle, the shot echoing like thunder, rock dust exploding near Luke's boot. The girls screamed. Nita moved first, a blur of black hides and fury. Her first bullet caught the scarred man in the throat, his laughter ending in a wet gasp. Luke felt his old instincts snap awake. He dove for cover, firing at the second raider who stumbled from his tent, gun half drawn, eyes wide. The fight unfolded in jagged heartbeats, shouts, muzzle flashes, the dry thunder of gunfire bouncing between stone walls. One man tried to flee toward the horses, but Nita was faster, her blade flashing as she dragged him down into the dust. Luke saw her then not as the woman he'd found in the desert, but as something elemental. The desert itself made flesh and fury. He didn't want to kill again, but when another raider swung his rifle toward the girls, instinct won. Luke fired, the man crumpling into the sand, his face hitting the ground with a hollow thud. The last of them, old, trembling, beard matted with dust, dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, hands raised. Please, he gasped. We were just following orders. Nita stepped close, her shadow falling over him. And now you follow them into the ground. Her knife rose and fell, a single motion, swift and final. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of their fire and the whisper of wind moving through the rocks. Luke stood there, chest heaving, smoke and blood stinging his throat. The setting sun poured over the canyon, red and gold, drenching the sand in color too vivid to be real. Nita wiped her blade clean and turned to him, her face unreadable. "It is done," she said. But Luke knew that wasn't true. The dead here might rest, but something in the air had changed. The canyon seemed to breathe, the ground humming faintly, as if the spirits themselves had stirred from their long sleep. The girls watched in silence as the last light faded, and when darkness came, it carried the same crimson hue as the day this land was first taken. The silence that followed the last gunshot was not the kind born of calm, but of something ancient exhaling after centuries of waiting. The canyon held its breath, the sound of dying men swallowed whole by the stones, and the air turned thick enough to taste. Luke stood motionless, rifle hanging limp in his hands, eyes fixed on the bodies sprawled in the dust. Smoke curled upward from a shattered lantern, its flame struggling before it winked out. Then another torch guttered, then another, until darkness pressed close around them. Only the faint light of the sinking sun bled along the horizon, turning the rock walls to rusted gold. Nita moved slowly, as if the weight of her vow had finally settled into her bones. She stepped to the center of the hollow and knelt beside the dead, her hands sinking into the sand. Her voice rose soft at first, then stronger, a low chant in Apache that wound through the air like smoke from a sacred fire. The girls huddled together, their small bodies trembling, faces streaked with dust and tears, eyes wide but unafraid. Luke felt something stir around them, an unseen shift as the wind began to move, not cold, but warm, carrying the scent of sage and rain, the kind of wind that whispered across graves and left the living unsure if they'd heard words or memories. It circled the camp, lifting the edges of Nita's dark cloak, ruffling Luke's hair, tugging at the dying embers. The whispers came next, soft sighs, rising and falling, thousands of them, a chorus without anger now. Only release. The torches died entirely, leaving the canyon lit by the ghost glow of the sky and the faint shimmer that seemed to come from the air itself. Luke's heart pounded, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The sound grew mournful, beautiful, endless. The sand stirred at Nita's feet, swirling into faint shapes, faces forming and dissolving like fog caught in sunlight. For a moment, Luke saw the outlines of men and women, warriors and children, their eyes closed, their mouths moving in silent prayer. Nita's chant deepened, her voice shaking as tears cut through the ash on her cheeks. Then, just as suddenly, the wind stopped. The air stilled, heavy and complete. The canyon seemed to sigh, every rock and bone relaxing into silence. Nita bowed her head, both hands pressed to the earth. "It is done," she whispered. "The debt is paid." The girls began to cry softly, not from fear, but something else. Something older and larger. Luke lowered himself beside them, unsure whether to speak or stay silent, the enormity of what had passed settling over him like a shroud. He looked to Nita, who sat motionless, her eyes closed, lips moving in what might have been a prayer or a farewell. "You said the curse would take the guilty," Luke murmured. "What about us?" She opened her eyes then, and for the first time since he'd met her, they looked light, not bright, but emptied of shadow. "We are not cursed," she said. "We are remembered." A final gust swept through the canyon, soft as a mother's hand, brushing against their faces before vanishing into the hills. In its wake came stillness, true stillness. The spirits had taken their vengeance, and at last they had found their peace. Nita's daughters clung to her, and Luke looked out at the reddened sand, the gold glinting faintly beneath the blood, and wondered if the land itself had finally exhaled. Morning came slow and pale, the light crawling across the canyon floor like a hesitant thing afraid to disturb the dead. The fire had burned itself down to a nest of gray embers, and the air carried that hollow quiet that comes after something vast has ended. Luke woke to the sound of soft movement, Nita rolling her blanket, the girls gathering what little they owned into a frayed bundle. The scent of sage lingered in the wind, faint but alive, like the memory of a song that had finally found its last note. He rose stiffly, his back aching, his hands raw from the night's violence. The ground around them still bore the dark stains of blood, but the weight in the air had changed. Where there had been dread, There was now something cleaner, if not quite merciful. Nita worked in silence, her face calm, eyes distant, as if she were already halfway gone. "You're leaving," Luke said quietly, though he already knew. She nodded once, her daughter standing close beside her, the smaller clutching a wooden doll worn smooth from years of being held. "Where will you go?" he asked. She paused, lifting her gaze to the horizon where the desert stretched endless in gold beneath the morning Sunday. "Home," she said simply, "where the earth still remembers us." The words carried a weight Luke couldn't touch, a truth carved by loss and endurance both. He wanted to say something, offer them safety, a place, a promise, but every word felt small beside the enormity of what she'd carried. Nita turned to him then, her dark hair stirring in the wind, and reached into her satchel. From within she drew the bone talisman, the one she'd held through every storm, every ghost, every prayer. Its turquoise beads caught the sun, glinting like tiny fragments of sky. "You carry their favor now," she said, holding it out to him. Luke hesitated, staring at the token as if it might burn him. "I don't think I deserve it," he said. "No one ever does," she replied, a faint curve of something like a smile ghosting her lips. "Peace is not given, it's earned." She stepped closer, pressing the talisman into his palm, her fingers rough but steady. "The spirits know your name now, Luke Carver. They saw you stand when others would have turned away. Wherever you go, they will walk beside you. Just don't make them regret it." He looked down at the talisman, its surface warm despite the morning chill, and when he raised his eyes again, Nita was already mounting her horse. The girls climbed up behind her, silent but unafraid. Luke wanted to call after them, to ask if he would see them again, but something in the way the sun touched the canyon rim bright, blinding, told him that question no longer mattered. Nita looked back once, her silhouette framed against the light. "The dead are quiet now," she said softly. "Let them rest. You do the same." Then she turned her horse and rode toward the rising sun, her daughter's forms small and steady behind her until they vanished into the shimmer of the desert heat. Luke stood alone in the hollow of bones, the talisman heavy around his neck, the wind whispering through the stones like a memory too vast to name. For the first time in years, he felt both burdened and free. The canyon was silent, but in that silence, he could almost hear them, the spirits, the land, and the faint heartbeat of peace, still fragile, still waiting to be earned. Weeks passed, and the land seemed to breathe again. The rains came early that year, soft and brief, painting thin green veins across the canyon walls where nothing had lived in seasons. By then, Luke Carver was long gone, riding north through Bitter Creek, a shadow among shadows, a man with the look of one who had walked too far into the past to ever find his way back. He kept mostly to himself, sleeping under the stars, speaking to no one unless he had to. Those who caught sight of him said there was something strange in his eyes, a stillness that wasn't emptiness but remembrance. A carved bone charm hung from his saddle horn, catching the sun with each slow turn of his horse. And though some took it for an Apache trinket, those who had lived long enough in the desert knew better. They said it was a mark of favor, the kind no white man had ever carried before. Around campfires and taverns, travelers told the story in pieces how the spirits of the canyon had been restless, how gunfire and ghostlight had lit the cliffs one night and left the air smelling of rain and blood. Some swore they'd found the bones of men half buried near the hollow, their eyes open as if they'd seen something too large to name. Others spoke of a woman and 2 girls riding east at dawn, faces calm, untouched by the weight of vengeance. No one knew their names, and Luke never offered them. He rode through towns and disappeared before sundown, never sleeping twice in the same place, always watching the horizon as if it might speak. When asked about the charm, he would only say, "Some debts don't end when the killing stops." And that was all anyone ever got from him. Yet sometimes, when the wind rose at dusk, drifting over Bitter Creek and the canyons beyond, it carried a rhythm that no one could quite explain, a low, steady pulse like distant drums echoing through the stones. The old-timers claimed it was the sound of the dead dancing, their anger finally at rest. Others said it was the heartbeat of the land itself, keeping count of those who'd remembered their promises. Children dared each other to listen close at night, to see if they could hear the whisper of a woman's chant woven into the wind. And somewhere out beyond the hills, a lone rider moved against the dying light, the talisman glinting with each step of his horse. Some said he was cursed, others blessed, but all agreed he was part of something the frontier could never bury. Time would blur the names, the details, the truth of it all. But the legend endured that once, in a place called the Hollow of Bones, a man had stood beside the lost and given the dead their due. And when the desert wind sighed through the canyon at sundown, it did not speak of vengeance anymore, but of balance restored, of mercy paid in full,